Sir, please, you have to help me. My grandma has been kidnapped.
Don't worry, I will get her back.
Her tiny fingers were trembling as they clutched the dark, expensive fabric of his sleeve. Her voice was a ragged whisper, breaking under the weight of a terror no child should ever know. Please, they took my grandma. They said she has to pay, or I'll never see her again. The entire room went cold. Ice clinked against glass as every conversation died a sudden, choked death. In the heart of Seoul's most exclusive private lounge, every eye turned toward the man at the head of the table. The man she had chosen to beg was no ordinary stranger. He was Jang Do-won, the most dangerous shadow in the city. And what he did next would send shockwaves through the streets of Seoul. Stick with me till the end, because this transformation will shock you to the core. It was a rain-slicked Tuesday night in the Gangnam district. Inside the Onyx Club, the air was thick with the scent of premium tobacco and the quiet, heavy weight of absolute power. This was Jang Do-won's throne room. Here, the servers moved like ghosts, trained to see everything and say nothing. In this room, there was only one law, Do-won's word. At the corner table, surrounded by his lieutenants, sat the man himself, a mountain of stone in a bespoke suit, the ink of a dragon's tail just visible above his stiff collar. At 42, Do-won had built a kingdom on the cold logic of efficiency. He didn't believe in luck, and he certainly didn't believe in mercy. To him, sentiment was a weakness. And in his world, weakness was a death sentence. But then, the heavy, soundproof doors were kicked open with a violence that made the bodyguards jump. A little girl, Kang Minji, stood in the center of the room. One of her braided pigtails had come undone, and a thin, jagged cut traced a line beneath her eye. While the city's elite looked away in discomfort, Minji didn't see the luxury. She saw the only person in the room who could actually do something. Without hesitation, she bypassed the armed guards and threw herself at his table, her tiny hands gripping his hand like a lifeline. The room held its collective breath. Do-won's bodyguards tensed, hands moving toward their jackets. No one approached the dragon uninvited. But as Do-won looked down into those wide, desperate eyes, the carefully constructed walls around his heart began to crack. The legend of Jang Do-won was written in the scars of Seoul's concrete heart. For 15 years, his name had been a whispered warning, a shadow that stretched across the skyscrapers of Gangnam and the dark alleys of Itaewon. But long before he was the dragon, he was a boy who had watched his world burn. The rise of Do-won wasn't fueled by a desire for wealth or a thirst for fame. It was forged in the freezing aftermath of a winter night 20 years ago, when a rival syndicate had torched his family's small dry cleaning business over a debt they didn't owe. He had stood on the sidewalk, a teenager with soot-stained cheeks, watching the only people who loved him vanish into a roar of orange flame. In the years that followed, Do-won systematically erased the boy who had cried on that sidewalk. He realized early that in a world of predators, the only way to survive was to become the thing that kept the monsters awake at night. He moved through the ranks of the underworld with a surgical, terrifying efficiency. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble, and he never let anyone close enough to see the ghost of the child he used to be. Every move was calculated, every alliance was tactical, and every execution was cold. He had built his empire on a foundation of absolute detachment. His lieutenants feared him because he was unreadable. His enemies feared him because he was unstoppable. He had surrounded himself with walls of ice, believing that emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. If you didn't love, you couldn't be hurt. If you didn't care, you couldn't be manipulated. By the age of 40, he had reached the summit, sitting atop a throne of steel and silence, ruling over a city that bowed to his shadow. But the walls he had built weren't just for protection. They had become a tomb. Do-won lived in a world of high-definition gray, where the only colors were the red of a ledger and the black of a suit. He had convinced himself that he was a machine, a sovereign who needed nothing and no one. He thought he had buried the boy from the sidewalk so deep that even he couldn't find him. He sat at the head of the table in the Onyx Club, the gold watch on his wrist ticking away the seconds of a life lived in perfect, frozen isolation. He was the most powerful man in Seoul, yet he was essentially a prisoner of his own making. He had forgotten the sound of a genuine laugh or the warmth of a selfless act. That was until the doors of the lounge were kicked open, and the cold, sterile air of his kingdom was pierced by a child's cry, a sound that vibrated against the ice of his heart until, for the first time in 2 decades, a crack began to form. The silence in the Onyx Club was so absolute that the distant hum of the soul traffic felt like a roar. Do-won remained frozen as Minji's small, frantic breaths hitched in the stillness. He didn't pull his arm away. Instead, he slowly lowered his gaze to the child's trembling hands. The thin cut beneath her eye was still weeping a bead of crimson, a jagged signature of the violence she had escaped. "Tell me," Do-won said. His voice was a low, vibrating bass that seemed to command the very air to stay still. "Who took her?" Minji swallowed hard, her pigtails shaking as she struggled to find her voice. "The men with the red bands," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "They came to the market stall. Grandma's son, he was just closing up. They said my father owed them a mountain of money. But my father, he's been gone since I was a baby." Do-won's eyes narrowed. The red bandanas were a bottom-feeding crew of debt collectors, the kind of vultures who thrived on interest rates that could never be repaid and the terror of those who couldn't fight back. They were the filth that lived in the cracks of the city's concrete, far below the dragon's notice, until now. "They pushed her, Mr. Boss," Minji continued, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. "They threw her into a black van. Grandma told me to run. She told me to find someone strong. She said they were going to liquidate the debt if the money wasn't there by midnight." Do-won felt a cold, familiar iron settle in his gut. He knew exactly what liquidating a debt meant in the mouth of a low-life collector. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the message. Sun-hee, a woman who had spent her life selling vegetables and raising a granddaughter on hope and hard work, was being treated as collateral for a ghost's debt. The lieutenants behind Do-won shifted, their leather holsters creaking. To them, this was a triviality, a street-level dispute that was beneath the dignity of the Jang Syndicate. But Do-won wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the way Minji clutched his hand, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to liquid. She didn't see a criminal, she saw a savior. And for a man who had built his life on being the villain, the weight of that trust was more terrifying than any war. Midnight was less than 3 hours away. The red bandanas didn't know it yet, but they hadn't just snatched an old woman from a market stall. They had reached into the past and pulled the dragon out of his cave. Do-won stood up, the movement so sudden it sent a shiver through his guards. The walls of ice weren't just cracking. They were beginning to melt into a flood of righteous, lethal fury. He looked down at the child and gave the first promise he had made in 20 years. "Stay here, Minji. I'm going to bring her home." The atmosphere in the Onyx Club shifted from stagnant tension to an electric, vibrating shock. Do-won remained standing, his tall frame casting a long, jagged shadow over the expensive mahogany table where maps of territory and legal documents for a multi-billion-won merger lay scattered. This merger was the culmination of 3 years of shadow warfare and delicate diplomacy. It was the deal that would consolidate the Jang Syndicate's power over the entire northern district. "Sir," his lead lieutenant, Park, stammered, his eyes darting between the merger contract and the trembling child still clutching Do-won's hand. "The representatives from the construction firm are arriving in 20 minutes. If we aren't there to sign, the deal is dead. We lose the harbor. We lose everything we've worked for." Do-won didn't look at Park. He didn't look at the stacks of paper that represented a fortune in laundered wealth. He reached out with his free hand and gently adjusted the collar of Minji's torn coat, his touch surprisingly steady for a man whose name was synonymous with violence. "The construction firm can wait," Do-won said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous edge. "The harbor isn't going anywhere. But an old woman in a black van is moving farther away every second you spend talking about money." The other men in the room exchanged panicked glances. To them, this was madness. They lived in a world where people were assets and lives were rounded down to the nearest decimal point. Abandoning the most significant merger in the decade for a nobody from a vegetable market was a breach of every cold-blooded principle Do-won had ever taught them. "This is a street-level debt, boss," another associate ventured, emboldened by the sheer absurdity of the situation. We can send a few boys to look into it tomorrow. We don't need to. Do-won turned his head, a predatory slowness in the movement that silenced the room instantly. The light caught the dragon tattoo on his neck, making the ink appear to writhe. You think I'm asking for your opinion on resource management? I am giving an order. He looked back at Park. Cancel the meeting. Tell them I had a more pressing engagement with a stakeholder they wouldn't understand. He turned to his head of security. Find out where the red bandanas take their liquidated collateral. I want every camera in the district scrubbed. I want to know who was driving that van, where they sleep, and who they love. We aren't just finding her. We are reminding this city that there are certain souls who are under the protection of the dragon. With a final, reassuring squeeze of Minji's hand, Do-won stepped away from the table of gold and toward the door of shadow. He was walking away from a fortune to chase a ghost of his own past, and as the heavy doors of the club swung open, the men behind him realized that the methodical machine they served had finally been replaced by a man. The order was given, and the hunt had begun. The black sedan glided into the narrow, rain-slicked alleyway of a neighborhood the city had long forgotten. Do-won stepped out, the soles of his polished shoes clicking against the uneven pavement. This wasn't the sparkling glass and steel of Gangnam. This was a place of peeling paint and rusted fire escapes, where the shadows felt heavier and the air tasted of wet concrete. He followed Minji up a flight of stairs that groaned under his weight to a tiny third-floor apartment. The door was slightly ajar, the frame splintered where a heavy boot had forced its way in. Inside, the silence was more haunting than the violence that had preceded it. The space was small but meticulously kept, a testament to Sunny's pride. Do-won's gaze fell to the floor, where a ceramic vase had been shattered into 1,000 jagged teeth. Beside it lay a bundle of yellow chrysanthemums, their bright petals crushed and trodden into the floorboards by a muddy footprint. These weren't the exotic, expensive blooms that adorned the tables at the Onyx Club. These were the simple offerings of a woman who found beauty in the mundane. Seeing them discarded like trash sent a sharp, cold spike through Do-won's chest. He moved toward the kitchen table, where a half-finished bowl of rice sat next to a small, hand-drawn card that read, "Happy Birthday, Grandma." The red bandanas hadn't just taken a person, they had desecrated a sanctuary. As he surveyed the room, he realized with a bitter clarity why they had chosen this door. Sun, he wasn't a rival or a threat. She was fair game. She was a woman with no sons to protect her and no powerful name to shield her. The perfect target for small-minded bullies who mistook cruelty for strength. His lieutenants stood awkwardly in the doorway, their presence an intrusion on the intimate grief of the room. They saw a crime scene, but Do-won saw a mirror. He remembered the smell of smoke from his own childhood home, the way the world looked when you realized that the people meant to keep you safe were powerless against the dark. They took her because they thought nobody would care, Do-won murmured, his voice sounding like grinding stone. He picked up one of the bruised flowers, his thumb tracing a torn petal. They thought she was a ghost in her own city. He turned to Park, his eyes burning with a lethal, focused clarity that made the younger man take a half-step back. The dragon wasn't just executing an order anymore. He was settling an old debt with the world. Find out which cellar they're hiding in. These men have forgotten that even the smallest home in this city is under a sky that belongs to me. I want them to realize their mistake before the sun comes up. The shadows in the small apartment seemed to lengthen as the weight of Sun-hee's absence pressed in from the walls. Do-won turned away from the shattered vase, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the dim light of the hallway. He found Minji sitting on the edge of a small wooden chair, her pigtails disheveled and her eyes fixed on the door as if her grandmother might walk through it at any moment. He didn't stand over her with the towering authority that made grown men tremble. Instead, Do-won did something that made his lieutenants freeze in the doorway. He sank to one knee on the worn linoleum floor. In his world, the dragon never knelt. But here, in this room that smelled of jasmine tea and fear, he lowered himself until he was eye level with the child. Gently, he reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His hand, usually a weapon of surgical precision, was incredibly soft. "Minji," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her grief. "Listen to me very carefully. From this moment on, You are under my shadow. My men will stay at this door. No one enters, and no one breathes in this hallway unless I say so. You are safe." Minji looked at him, her lip trembling. "But Grandma, they said she was a bad person because of the money. They said no one would come for her." Do-won's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy coin, a signature of his high-ranking status in the syndicate, and placed it in her small palm. They lied. In this city, people only see what they want to see. But I see you, and I see her. He took her tiny hand in his fingers closing around hers with a grip that was as much a shield as it was a bond. "I am going to bring her back. I am going to walk her through that door, and she will sit in that chair, and you will have your birthday. Do you understand?" Minji nodded slowly, the terror in her eyes beginning to give way to a fragile, desperate hope. "Do you promise?" Do-won looked into her brown eyes, seeing the reflection of the boy who had once waited for a savior who never came. He felt the ice around his heart crack for the final time. "I have spent 20 years making people fear my name," he whispered. "But I have never made a promise I couldn't keep. To anyone. Especially not to you." He stood up, the warmth of her hand lingering on his skin like a brand. He didn't look back as he walked toward the door, but the air in the room felt different. The darkness no longer felt like a threat, but like a guardian. As he stepped into the rain-slicked night, Do-won wasn't just a boss looking for a victim. He was a man fulfilling a blood oath. The interrogation, where Do-won tracks down the red bandanas to show them the true cost of their business. The neon signs of the city's underbelly flickered like dying stars as Do-won stepped into the damp, lightless basement of a shuttered gambling den. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap adrenaline. In the center of the room, two men, members of the red bandana crew, were zip-tied to metal folding chairs. They were young, barely into their 20s, with faces full of the false bravado that comes from bullying the weak. When Do-won emerged from the shadows, that bravado evaporated. They knew his face. Everyone in the underworld knew the face of the dragon, though few lived to describe the coldness in his eyes up close. "Please, Mr. Jang," one of them stammered, his teeth chattering. "We didn't know the old woman was connected. We were just collecting. It was just business." Do-won didn't answer. He didn't scream, and he didn't strike them. Instead, he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his inner breast pocket. He unfolded it with agonizing slowness, smoothing out the creases on a nearby wooden crate. It was the drawing he had taken from the apartment, a stick-figure portrait of a smiling woman holding a child's hand, surrounded by lopsided yellow flowers. "This," Do-won said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that vibrated in the small space. "This is what you call business." He held the drawing inches from the lead collector's face. "You broke into a home that smells of jasmine and peace. You terrified a child who has nothing in this world but the woman you threw into a van. You stepped on these flowers with your muddy boots because you thought no one was watching. We'll give her back," the other man sobbed, his eyes darting toward the shadows. "She's at the old tannery. We haven't touched her, we swear." Do-won leaned in closer, the dragon on his neck appearing to pulse in the dim light. The contrast was stark, the most powerful criminal in Seoul holding a child's crayon drawing, as if it were a holy relic. "You don't understand the magnitude of what you've done," Do-won murmured. "You didn't just take a grandmother. You reminded me of who I was before I became this." He tapped the drawing. "You brought a child's grief into my world. And now, I am going to bring the dragon into yours." He straightened his suit jacket, the cold precision of his movements returning. He had the location. He had the motive. And as he turned to leave the basement, he left the drawing on the crate, a silent witness to the beginning of the end for the red bandanas. He didn't need to say anything more. The terror in their eyes told him they finally realized that in their pursuit of a few thousand won, they had accidentally summoned a god of vengeance. The industrial district at 2 a.m. was a skeletal landscape of rusted iron and freezing fog. The auto shop leaned against the docks like a rotting tooth, its interior glowing with a sickly yellow light. Inside, the air smelled of old grease and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Beck Sunny sat on a crate in the center of the bay, her hands bound with rough twine, her face bruised but her spirit unbroken. Standing over her was Choi, the leader of the debt collection syndicate. He was a man draped in counterfeit luxury, a gold-leafed watch that ticked too loudly, and a designer jacket that didn't fit his narrow shoulders. He was flash and no substance, a predator who only hunted the elderly and the unarmed. "You're late, old woman," Choi sneered, checking his watch as his 5 enforcers paced the perimeter with iron pipes. "No one is coming. No one cares about a vegetable seller from the..." The massive sliding steel doors didn't just open. They groaned as if the building itself were bowing. A single black sedan idled in the mist outside, its headlights cutting 2 blinding white tunnels through the dark. Jang Do-won stepped into the shop alone. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Choi's smirk faltered, his face draining of color as he recognized the man in the bespoke charcoal suit. "D-Do-won. Jang Do-won." Choi stammered, his bravado vanishing like smoke. This is a misunderstanding. This is just a small-time collection. Surely the dragon isn't interested in..." "I am interested in what you stepped on," Do-won interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. He walked toward the center of the bay, ignoring the enforcers who gripped their pipes with trembling hands. He stopped 5 feet from Choi. The contrast was a lesson in true power. Choi, sweating and frantic, surrounded by his men, and Do-won, standing in perfect, lethal stillness. Do-won reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, crushed yellow chrysanthemum he had taken from Sunny's floor. He dropped it at Choi's feet. "You thought she was fair game because she was small," Do-won murmured, his eyes locking onto Choi's with a terrifying, predatory focus. "But you forgot that every small thing in this city lives under my sky." Choi tried to reach for a weapon hidden in his waistband, but Do-won was faster, a blur of shadow and controlled violence. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance, his hand catching Choi's throat with the strength of a hydraulic press. The enforcers froze. They were bullies, not soldiers, and they knew they were looking at their own deaths. "You have 5 minutes to disappear from this district," Do-won whispered into Choi's ear. "If I see a red bandana after tonight, I won't just liquidate your debt. I will liquidate your existence." He released the man, who collapsed into a heap of expensive silk and terror. As the thugs scrambled into the night, Do-won turned his back on them completely. He knelt before Sunny, his hands steady as he produced a small silver knife to cut her bonds. For the first time that night, the dragon's eyes were soft. "I promised Minji I'd bring you home," he said quietly. "And I never break a promise." The following morning, the industrial district did not wake to its usual hum of fear, but to a silence that felt like a long-held breath finally released. In the cold light of dawn, the red bandanas were no longer the kings of the concrete. By Do-won's command, the syndicate was not simply dismantled, it was forced to undergo a ritual of absolute restitution. Do-won stood on the rooftop of a building overlooking the neighborhood market, his dark coat snapping in the wind. Below, the men who had spent years as predators were now being herded like cattle by Do-won's silent, stone-faced lieutenants. They weren't being taken to a basement or a pier. Instead, they were being marched to the very doorsteps they had once terrorized. Under the watchful eyes of the dragon's elite guard, Choi and his remaining enforcers were forced to open their ledgers, the thick, stained books that recorded the blood and sweat of the elderly. One by one, the stolen protection fees were tallied. Do-won had dictated that every one taken must be returned threefold, drawn directly from the rival syndicate's hidden accounts. The market elders, people like Sun-hee who had bowed their heads for years to avoid the blow of a fist, watched in stunned disbelief. They saw the bullies who had once smashed their stalls now kneeling on the pavement, handing back envelopes of cash with trembling hands. It wasn't just a return of currency, it was the return of their dignity. Do-won watched as the neighborhood began to breathe again, the heavy cloud of extortion lifting as the red bandanas were systematically stripped of their power, their assets, and their territory. "The money is secondary," Do-won murmured to Park, who stood a respectful distance behind him. "I want them to understand that the price of a soul in this city is higher than they can ever afford to pay. I want it known that from this day forward, the interest in bullying the helpless is death." As the final ledger was closed and the red bandanas were driven out of the city limits with a warning that echoed like a funeral bell, Do-won felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. The walls of ice he had built over 20 years had not just cracked. They had served a purpose he never anticipated. He had used his darkness to create a circle of light. The price of his own soul had been high, paid in years of isolation, but as he watched the elders stand tall in their market stalls once more, he realized the debt was finally being settled. The dragon hadn't just won a war. He had reclaimed a piece of the boy who once believed in justice. 6 months had passed since the night the dragon descended from his mountain of ice, and the neighborhood of the old vegetable market had transformed. It wasn't that the streets had been paved with gold, but the air itself felt lighter, no longer thick with the suffocating humidity of fear. The red bandanas were a fading ghost story, replaced by a new, unspoken reality. Beck Sunny's market stall was now the most vibrant in the district, rebuilt with sturdy cedar and shielded by a wide, hunter-green awning that kept the rain from her produce. She moved with a newfound grace, her laughter ringing out as she bartered with neighbors. She knew, as did everyone in the district, that they were under a quiet protection. There were no flashy enforcers and no demands for money. Instead, there were simply men in well-fitted suits who occasionally lingered at the corner, their presence a silent promise that the peace of the market was sacrosanct. Jang Do-won sat in the back of his black sedan, parked at a discreet distance. He no longer spent his Tuesday nights exclusively in the smoke-filled rooms of the Onyx Club. Through the tinted glass, he watched as Minji, now wearing a bright yellow raincoat that matched her cheerful disposition, ran toward her grandmother, clutching a new drawing in her hand. The multi-billion-won merger he had walked away from had eventually been settled on his terms, but it felt like a hollow victory compared to what he felt now. He looked down at his own hand, the one Minji had gripped so desperately 6 months ago. The scars were still there, and the dragon tattoo still climbed his neck, but the man beneath the ink was different. He had traded a throne of absolute fear for a watchtower of silent guardianship. He had learned that true power wasn't found in how many people bowed to you, but in how many people felt safe because you existed. The car door opened, and his lead lieutenant, Park, leaned in. The construction firms are waiting for the weekly briefing, boss. Shall we head back to Gangnam? Do-won watched as Minji spotted his car and gave a small, enthusiastic wave. She was the only person in the city who didn't fear him, and that trust was the most valuable asset he owned. It was the anchor that kept him from drifting back into the abyss of his own cold logic. In a moment, Park, Do-won murmured, a rare, genuine smile softening the harsh lines of his face. I want to see if she finishes that drawing. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a grandmother. He had saved the boy who had once watched his own world burn. By protecting Minji's innocence, he had finally reclaimed his own soul. The sovereign had a new code now, written not in blood or debt, but in the simple, unwavering trust of a child. As the car finally pulled away, merging into the pulse of the city, the dragon left behind a neighborhood that was finally allowed to bloom.